Hey guys, tonight we're diving straight into the most bizarre rulebook ever. We're exploring the weird, confusing and often quite messy reality of Tudor England. We aren't here to dwell on Henry VIII's weird facial hair or Elizabeth's overly pale makeup. We're focusing on the laws, customs and social codes that made existence back then tougher than figuring out your taxes while arguing with your least favourite relative. So, before you get too comfortable, go ahead, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you actually dig the content I'm making, and maybe drop a comment letting me know the current time and what absolutely useless historical rule you'd resurrect if you had the power. Seriously, someone out there is probably itching to outlaw cargo shorts. Now kill the overhead lights, crank up that ambient sound machine, maybe bundle up so snug a Tudor sumptuary agent couldn't find a single thing to critique about your bedding. Let's pause on that for a second. Imagine facing a fine just for sporting clothes that look too expensive. Or what if your Sunday barbecue could land you in the jailhouse because it was a forbidden day for meat? Picture needing a bureaucratic permit just to paint your front door a specific shade or risk a public whipping. Ever yelled at a reckless driver? In Tudor England, even a rude word to the wrong person could result in your ears being sliced off. And forgetting to take off your hat for a minor nobleman. That wasn't just poor manners, it was potentially treason. Congrats. You've just woken up in the middle of the year 1553, smack in the heart of Tudor life. You've got a massive ale hangover, your one good spoon is gone, and the local cop is now eyeing your socks with suspicion. Good luck. If you thought fashion was only about personal style, welcome to Tudor England, where the actual colour of your hat was a jailable offence. The sumptuary statutes strictly dictated exactly what you could wear, right down to the little laces on your shoes. Forget trying to express yourself. Your closet essentially functions as a legal brief, and the punishment for offences involving velvet is surprisingly harsh. Let's paint a picture. You wake up, stretch, and reach for that shirt you like. Except, before you put it on, you actually have to consult a giant government rule scroll. Will this specific wool tunic get you fined? Is the neck of your shirt too wide? Are your shoelaces a suspiciously high-status shade of royal blue? You aren't just getting dressed, you're essentially preparing for a court deposition. Welcome to your new daily panic. It's a wardrobe determined by a committee, enforced by officials with sticks. The entire point of these rules was to make the class hierarchy visible immediately. Nobles could wear silk, fancy velvet and real gold thread. Merchants were limited to simple but durable fabrics. Servants, workers and everybody else? Hope you're a fan of brown, unsure of your social standing? Don't stress, the sumptuary laws were very happy to remind you. Want to wear purple? That's strictly royalty only. Want to rock satin? Better be a high-ranking earl, or at least a close pal of the Queen who won't care. Get caught wearing anything beyond your designated station, and you might get fined, publicly humiliated, or even made to stand naked in the public square while your neighbours debate if you're a bigger idiot or fashion victim. It's a world where picking out clothes is like playing a weird, dangerous game of legal twister. You might be wondering, how would anyone even know the thread count of my stockings? Well, Tudor England was absolutely lousy with people whose side hustle was snitching on their neighbours. A jealous cousin, your business rival down the street, that woman who secretly thinks you're getting too big for your britches. All of them are potential informers. The whole system thrived on pettiness, suspicion and a level of fashion policing that would make a modern online comment section look incredibly forgiving. And the statutes weren't just about colour, buttons, embroidery, even the shape of your sleeves. Everything was tightly controlled. Say you wanted a little flair, maybe a sharp green jacket to liven up your week. Unfortunately, unless you possessed an actual title and the right level of land income, that shade of green was probably illegal. The laws could change every year, too, just to keep you off balance. You practically needed an accountant just to put on clothes and a lawyer to defend your choice of hat feathers. Sometimes even the feathers themselves had a rigid hierarchy. Swan feathers were for the super wealthy, goose for the merely respectable, and pigeon for those with absolutely zero expectations. Here's one easy Tudor tip. If you're broke, just aim for the bland, invisible look. Brown, grey, muddy colours. Congratulations. You're not breaking any laws, but you are blending perfectly into the backdrop of every historical tapestry ever woven. Clothes weren't just expensive, they were a liability. If you were lucky, you owned maybe 2 full sets of clothes, one for your daily misery and a Sunday best outfit that was just slightly less filthy. And if you grew out of your one legal tunic, well, good luck finding a replacement garment in the exact right legal shade. Why all these bizarre rules? Officially, to prevent regular people from putting on airs and to maintain strict social order. Unofficially, it was a subtle way for the rich to keep the poor down and for the Crown to make some easy cash from fines. It's basically the HOA of history, but with more executions and fewer newsletters. So, as you tiptoe out the door, carefully wrapped in legally acceptable brown wool and covered in the familiar scratch of honest fabric, you see a nobleman ride by in fine fur, glittering gold, and a hat the size of a small corgi. You nod slightly, careful not to show any envy, and try not to accidentally step on your own forbidden shoelaces. Fashion in Tudor England was literally a matter of survival, and if you messed it up, it wasn't just an awkward mistake, it was a crime. So the next time you put on mismatched socks, just remember, at least you won't end up in court over it. The first meal of your Tudor day is a culinary minefield. What you eat, when you eat it, and who is allowed to share the meal with you are all governed by complex, unspoken rules. Hope you weren't craving bacon, because that's reserved for Sundays and religious feast days. Everyone else is just praying their bowl of pottage doesn't contain last week's mystery meat. Let's look at the breakfast table. If you're imagining sunny side-up eggs, plump sausages and a freshly baked croissant, you need to slam that mental door shut. The typical Tudor breakfast is less brunch goals and more, did I just chew a piece of old bark? For most people, the main meal is pottage, an ancient simmering mix of oats, peas, barley, whatever random roots they found, and anything else that hasn't run away yet. If you're incredibly lucky, a piece of hard old bread might be floating in there, the culinary equivalent of hitting the lottery, except your prize is a chunk that's only slightly mouldier than usual. But even this meagre stew is subject to rules. During the 40 days of Lent, and on specific fast days, which if you're counting seem to happen every time you feel hungry, you're forbidden from eating meat, eggs or dairy. That's right, your morning already feels like a massive defeat. And now the church wants to ensure you suffer extra. Try sneaking in a forbidden strip of bacon, and your neighbour, who definitely saw you purchase that suspiciously fat piglet last week, might just report you to the local constable. Enjoy your breakfast. You are being watched. Who you share a meal with also matters a lot. The head of the household is seated at the table's high end, which is Tudor speak for the spot closest to the house's single warm patch. Everyone else is spread out in strict social rank, all the way down to the household dog, who's mostly there to catch scraps and silently judge your terrible table manners. Servants and apprentices? They wait their turn, eating the leftovers only after you're completely done. And if you happen to be a woman, breakfast comes with a double portion of expectations. You're up first, responsible for cooking, serving, and making sure your husband's pottage is only mildly lumpy. Manners operate as their own separate legal code. You eat with a spoon if you're fortunate enough to own one, a knife if you're feeling bold, and your bare hands if you've totally given up. Forks, by the way, do exist, but using one is seen as suspiciously foreign and refined. The Tudor equivalent of texting at the table. When seated for dinner, wipe your hands on the tablecloth, but never on your clothing. And for heaven's sake, don't slurp. Slurping is considered French, and we absolutely do not do anything French. If you're part of the wealthy class, breakfast means options. Rich Tudors might start their day with manchette, high-quality white bread, some good cheese, perhaps a fried egg, and a cup of ale or very weak beer. Yes, beer for breakfast, because drinking the local water will kill you much faster than the pottage will. And if you're truly posh, you can enjoy extravagant imports like marmalade, honey, or the kind of butter that isn't half filled with candle wax. These luxuries naturally come with their own legal restrictions. For instance, fine white bread is reserved solely for the well-to-do. A peasant caught munching on manchi is likely to be accused of either theft, witchcraft, or acting above their station, which is actually the worst crime of all. For everyone else, hope you enjoy horse bread, a depressing mixture of beans, bran, and random grains, originally baked for actual horses, then repurposed for human breakfast, because why let anything go to waste if you can chew it without breaking a tooth? Congratulations. That's one more day with your medieval dental records still intact. And let's not forget the ale. It's not the fun party kind. Think of it as your morning juice, only significantly less nutritious and slightly more likely to contain a drowned insect. Children drink it, adults drink it. Even the dog might get a taste if he looks especially thirsty. It's weak, hardly alcoholic, but it's much safer than the water, which often comes with a complimentary dose of dysentery. Finally, the entire experience is shrouded in worry about food regulations. Selling bread that is too light? That's strictly illegal. Adding sawdust to your pottage to make it last longer? Against the rules. Trying to sell an egg on a Sunday? That's a whole scandal. If you get caught, expect to be fined, publicly shamed, or have your breakfast confiscated right in front of the entire village. So there you sit, spoon in hand, eyeing your bowl of bubbling uncertainty. Breakfast isn't merely a meal, it's a tightrope walk between starvation, scandal, and the constant risk of breaking a law you didn't even know existed. Bon appétit. But don't say that out loud. It's suspiciously French. In Tudor England, a simple hand gesture can be a huge political statement, and bowing is practically an Olympic event. If you forget to take off your cap or don't curtsy low enough, prepare for instant social exile. Or at minimum, a deeply critical raised eyebrow from a man wearing a ridiculously silly hat. Let's set the scene again. You're inching out your front door, determined to get through the day without embarrassing your family. The street is bustling with neighbours, vendors, and that one guy who always seems to be lurking, waiting for someone to screw up the protocol. You spot your neighbour across the way. You give a polite nod, but wait, was that sufficient? Should you have offered a full bow? Is she truly your social equal, or was her great-aunt knighted for services rendered to the Crown's turnip operation? Congratulations. You're already overwhelmed with anxiety and you haven't even made it to the marketplace yet. Bowing, you quickly learn, isn't some optional little flourish. It's required cardio. Men bow from the waist, women perform a curtsy. Children manage whatever awkward half-mimicry they can pull off without falling over. The deeper your bow or curtsy, the more respect you're signalling, and the greater the likelihood you'll end up toppling into a muddy puddle. Meeting someone of significantly higher status? That requires a full deep bend from the waist. And if you're aiming for extra obedience, a complete hat removal. Yes, even if it's currently pouring rain, snowing heavily, or your hair looks like you just wrestled a small weasel. Now, hats are an entire specialised branch of etiquette. If you're wearing one, it's essentially a mobile apology just waiting for the right moment. Entering a private house, off with the cap. Greeting the town's chief bailiff, off with the hat. Walking past the church. Better tip it quickly just in case God is watching and keeping a spreadsheet of politeness violations. There's even a precise way to hold your hat, by the brim, held low to your side, never ever swinging it around like a distracted child. And if your hat sports any feathers, those come with their own specific rulebook, depending on your exact rank and the current mood of the local feather inspector. For women, the stakes are just as high. The correct curtsy involves a gentle bend of the knees, a slight dip of the head, and a graceful arm movement, as if you're about to accept an invisible basket of turnips. A curtsy that's too shallow marks you instantly as disrespectful. Too deep, and you risk making the other person nervous about your odd intentions, or possibly your sense of balance. And don't forget to keep your eyes lowered, but not so low that you fail to see if the family chicken has wandered into your path. Many a social disaster has been caused by a curtsy that ended with a collision with poultry, and then there's the handshake, which is less a greeting and more the start of a tough negotiation. Handshakes are reserved only for equals, business partners, and for moments when you both tacitly agree not to mention the incident with the goat that happened last Michaelmas. But be careful not to squeeze too hard, that's seen as aggressive. Too limp? Clearly, you're either plotting treason or carrying a contagious disease. If you're unsure of what to do, just default to the bow. At least if you overdo it, people will only assume you're terribly polite or currently suffering from severe lower back pain. All of this means that merely walking to the store is an elaborate obstacle course of nodding, bowing, hat removing, curtsying, and occasionally complex hand gestures that would look alarmingly like jazz hands to a modern person. One single missed greeting, and you might instantly become the main subject of town gossip. Did you see how Thomas barely nodded at Lady Twistleton? What an absolute scandal. His poor, poor mother. The irony is, of course, that nobody is ever truly certain what the exact rule is. Was it 3 bows for the local mayor, or only 2? Should you wait to be greeted first? Is it okay to wave at your cousin if she's standing right next to the Lord High Fishmonger? The answer is always the same. If you're in doubt, do everything. Bow, nod, smile, remove your hat, perform a small curtsy, and then pretend to intensely admire a passing cloud until everyone finally leaves you alone. So, as you move through your Tudor day, always remember, every single encounter is a potential social landmine. Play it safe, keep your hat ready, your knees flexible, and your apologies pre-written. Because in Tudor England, the art of the greeting is less about being friendly and more about surviving public humiliation with your dignity mostly intact. Think your morning breath is bad. In Tudor times, it could have been branded a public menace. Hygiene wasn't just a personal choice, it was sometimes legally enforced. Bathing less often was actually a recommended practice. And woe betide anyone who emptied their chamber pot in the wrong direction. Let's start with a nice deep breath, if you dare. In Tudor England, the air and the smell of the streets were a combination of open farmyard and public compost heap. You stumble out your front door into a fog of wood smoke, horse manure, and whatever's been fermenting in your neighbour's week-old laundry. The bad news? Nobody has invented deodorant. The good news? Nobody actually expects you to smell like a bed of daisies. In fact, if you're too clean, people will immediately start to get suspicious. Bathing, you see, was believed to be not only physically dangerous, but also borderline heretical. The medical consensus, provided by a barber surgeon who also pulls teeth and probably sells stale meat pies, was that hot water opened up your pores, making you highly vulnerable to disease, moral sin, or worst of all, a chilly draught. A proper Tudor might take a bath maybe once a month, if that. And even then, it was a massive operation. Hauling water, heating it over a massive fire, and then getting into the tub before anyone else had the chance. Families often shared the same bath water, so if you were the youngest child, you could expect to bob for bits of straw and perhaps someone else's mystery rash. When it came to teeth, the average Tudor solution was to ignore the problem entirely. Toothbrushes, as we know them, hadn't really caught on yet. Most people either rinsed their mouths with vinegar, chewed on various twigs, or simply let nature take its course. If you were wealthy, maybe you'd splurge on a rag and some ground sage. But for everyone else, the main objective was, don't let your teeth kill you before the plague does. Toothache? That's what the local barber surgeon was for. His kit included pliers, a fervent prayer, and 0 anaesthesia. But the real excitement revolves around the chamber pot. Forget modern plumbing. In most Tudor homes, you did your business into a simple, humble pot, which was emptied, if you were courteous, outside, and if you weren't, straight out the nearest window. Laws were passed to try and regulate this, requiring people to shout, "Gardaloo!" before tossing their liquid gold onto the street. But the results were inconsistent. A hurried or sleepy toss meant your neighbours might wake up to more than just the rooster crowing, get caught dumping at the wrong time of day or from the wrong floor, and you might find yourself facing a ducking stool, the official punishment for public health hazards, overly talkative women, and general nuisances. A few chilly dips in the local pond and suddenly everyone is following the rules. At least until next Tuesday. Public bathhouses did exist, but their reputation was less spa day and more unlicensed rave with extra boils. Eventually, church authorities decided these places were breeding grounds for vice and disease, and most were quickly shut down. If you wanted a proper wash, you did it privately at home, behind locked doors, ideally without any witnesses and definitely without too much enthusiasm. Clothes were washed even less often. Laundry day was a rare event. Hauling and heating water and scrubbing fabric by hand was back-breaking labour, and real soap was expensive. Most people simply layered on more clothes to help mask the smell. Dirt, it turns out, was a kind of default Tudor cologne. The government, not content with the general chaos, occasionally issued local ordinances to force some kind of order. Street sweepers were hired to shovel the muck from the main roads, and in London, laws required every householder to clean the area directly in front of their door. Of course, the easiest solution for most people was to just sweep the muck a few feet to the left, right into the path of a less observant neighbour. Community spirit, Tudor style. So the next time you're dreading a morning shower or grumbling about flossing, remember, in Tudor England, hygiene was a constant juggling act between sheer laziness, complete paranoia, and genuine legal danger. Smell too terrible and you risk the ducking stool. Smell too nice, and someone might seriously accuse you of witchcraft. Either way, it's probably safest to just stand upwind, keep your mouth shut, and hope no one is currently emptying a chamber pot above your head. Walking to the public market in Tudor England isn't so much a leisurely stroll as it is a frantic dance of survival. The roads are pure chaos, clogged with livestock, beggars and heavy carts. Oh, and anyone who dares to block the path risks a hefty fine, a severe dirty look, or stepping in something you will never truly be able to wash off. Start your journey by stepping outside your door and immediately tripping over a sleeping pig. The pig, for the record, actually has more rights to the street than you do, especially if it belongs to a rich neighbour or a particularly stubborn widow. Chickens scurry underfoot. Geese honk with the kind of self-righteous rage that suggests they've been plotting against you all week. And somewhere close by, a dog is already staring at your shoelaces as if they represent the culinary highlight of his morning. You'd really like to walk in a straight line, but Tudor streets are a living, breathing obstacle course. There are carts piled impossibly high with turnips, children wielding sticks like imaginary swords, and grown men violently arguing about the price of onions right in the middle of the main thoroughfare. The road surface itself is a disgusting patchwork of mud, manure, and whatever fell off the last passing wagon. Potholes frequently double as local ponds after a good rain. Just hope you remembered to wear your wooden clogs. Though, honestly, nothing short of a small boat will save your poor socks. Blocking the flow of traffic is an actual crime, by the way, and it's not a minor one. The town constable literally has nothing better to do than issue tickets to people for standing around too long in the street. If you stop to gossip, tie your shoes, or wrestle a particularly opinionated sheep out of the path, you risk a fine. The law technically says you're supposed to keep to the side, but since the side is often a muddy ditch or an open sewer, this is less about maintaining order and more about gambling with your personal dignity. Get caught obstructing the way and you'll get a stern talking to, or worse, you'll become the main subject of local gossip for 2 solid weeks. Social hierarchy dictates everything, even who gets to walk where. Nobles are entitled to the middle of the road, merchants stick to the well-trodden lanes, and peasants are expected to squeeze themselves against the buildings, ideally trying to completely blend into the scenery. Accidentally brush up against a noblewoman's gown with your filthy sleeve. Prepare for a long lecture, a threat of legal action, and, if she's feeling generous, a public performance of disgusted sighing. You'll also need to watch out for beggars, some of whom have incredibly ingenious methods of parting you from your meagre coins. One might lunge at your feet and loudly demand a penny for footpath improvements. Another, more entrepreneurial beggar may set up shop at a particularly muddy crossing, offering to physically escort you across for a small fee, though there's a good chance you'll just be handed off to the next beggar in the relay line and end up exactly where you started. Let's not forget the carts. Horse-drawn, ox-drawn, or dragged by a team of very determined children. These wooden death traps career through the streets with no brakes and even less concern for the safety of pedestrians. There are laws requiring carts to yield to noble riders. But for everyone else, best of luck. You can always try waving your arms and shouting, but the only thing you're guaranteed to attract is a spray of suspiciously warm street water. Oh, and then there is the constant looming danger from above. Chamber pots. Remember, any open window could suddenly become a waterfall at a moment's notice. It's polite for the pot emptier to shout "Gardeloo" as a warning, but let's just say not everyone is that diligent. Sometimes, the first hint you get is a cold splash, followed by peals of hysterical laughter and the smug knowledge that tomorrow it might be your turn. By the time you reach the market, you'll have successfully sidestepped livestock, small children, heavy carts, thick mud, and possibly a giant rolling wheel of cheese on a rogue adventure. Your shoes feel heavier, your dignity feels lighter, and you're now convinced that walking in Tudor England should immediately qualify as an Olympic sport. So the next time you complain about crowded city sidewalks or slow walkers at the mall, remember, in Tudor England, the actual challenge was making it anywhere with your shoes and your reputation still in one piece. Watch your step. It's 4 o'clock, you're 3 ales deep, and the local constable is watching your every move. Public drunkenness is officially frowned upon, but unofficially it's pretty much expected. The main trick is simply not to get caught being too noticeable. Unless, of course, it's alehouse inspection day, in which case the real crime is failing to buy the inspector a round of drinks. Let's be clear. In Tudor England, ale is life. Water is a risky gamble with dysentery. But ale, blessed low-alcohol, surprisingly nutritious ale, flows constantly from breakfast straight to bedtime. The village alehouse isn't just the local pub. It's the social hub, the town square, the news network, the confessional booth, and the best place to hide from your in-laws, all rolled into one smoky, crowded room. Everyone is here. Old men telling the same stories for the 10th time, mothers rocking babies under the tables, and the town jester, who is really just a farmer with too many opinions and a very loose grasp on reality. Drinking, however, comes with a legal catch. While it's completely normal to have a jug or 2 or 4 of ale with your friends, being actually drunk in public is a punishable offence. The law states you must remain orderly and of good conversation. The unspoken reality is, as long as you can manage to stumble home without starting a violent fistfight, serenading the mayor's wife, or falling headfirst into the duck pond, you're generally in the clear. If you do get caught weaving your way home or yelling bad poetry at a pig, expect a fine, a long night in the stocks, or, if you're truly unlucky, a very embarrassing entry in the town's official records. Alehouse rules are numerous and often mysterious. There's the official ale taster, whose job is to ensure the brew meets the required standard. Spoiler alert, the standard is basically not poisonous. Mostly, the ale taster is both feared and secretly envied, as he has the authority to shut down an establishment, but also the right to demand endless free samples in the name of quality control. If he's having a bad day, your best move is to flatter him, offer a fresh, clean tankard, and quietly hope he lost his sense of taste sometime last Tuesday. There's also the unwritten code of the regulars. Always greet the landlord first. Failure to do so may earn you a mug full of what passes for cleaning water. Never, ever sit in old John's chair unless you're prepared to arm wrestle him for it. And if the local musicians start playing, you're expected to loudly clap, sing along, and pretend you know all the lyrics, even if the words change drastically every single verse. Nothing ruins an alehouse evening faster than being branded the dreaded mirth killer. Let's not forget the alewife, the formidable woman who actually runs the entire place. She is the judge, the jury, and the enforcer, armed with a wooden spoon and a glare that could instantly wilt a turnip. Disrespect her, and you'll find your ale mysteriously watered down, your tab instantly doubled, and your reputation permanently ruined. Praise her pie, however, and she might allow you to stay after closing time for the last few dregs, assuming you help sweep the floor and promise never to mention the secret ingredient. Spoiler: it's always lard. The law, meanwhile, is a constantly shifting beast. On festival days, the constable is conveniently less observant, and the entire village might end up merrily staggering down the street together, arm in arm, singing about things best left forgotten. But on inspection day, when the magistrate is in town, everyone suddenly remembers how to sit up straight, speak softly, and claim they've been drinking only small beer the whole time. The constable, who knows exactly how many times you've fallen off your stool this week, just shrugs and accepts his complimentary pint. Justice, Tudor style. By evening, as the candles flicker and the singing becomes rowdier, you realise that public drunkenness is a fine balance of timing, skill, and sheer luck. Too much, and you'll seriously regret it. Too little, and you'll miss out on all the great stories. Just the right amount, and you might make it home with your dignity, your hat, and maybe even a leftover pie for tomorrow's breakfast. So, the next time you raise a glass, remember, in Tudor England, the alehouse isn't just about getting tipsy. It's about surviving the absurd rules, skillfully dodging the fines, and never, ever underestimating the alewife's left hook. Cheers! Tudor markets are where order and sanity go to die. Prices are supposedly fixed by law. Haggling is essentially a blood sport, and if you dare to sell a turnip that looks suspicious to someone, expect an immediate visit from the official turnip inspector. It's capitalism, but with more frantic chickens. Picture yourself elbow deep in a massive sea of humanity before you've even had your breakfast ale. The noise is absolutely deafening. Vendors shouting, children shrieking, and a goose choir performing its own chaotic version of ye old greatest hits. Every single sense is under attack. Garlic, rotting fish, new leather, and the unmistakable scent of a pig that's had a long morning and absolutely zero regrets. You cautiously approach the cheese stall, feeling equal parts hopeful and terrified. The law technically states that food prices must be fair, which is the Tudor way of saying, whatever the local alderman feels like charging. Today, the cheese merchant, Mrs. Butterwick, is a formidable figure with forearms like cured hams and a tight smile that signals she knows you can't afford the aged cheddar. She informs you that the price is fixed, but that haggling is still encouraged for the sake of long tradition. This is, by the way, a massive trap. If you haggle too aggressively, you'll be branded a miser and instantly risk the collective wrath of Mrs. Butterwick and her large extended family, all of whom seem to be lurking right behind the stall just in case. Try to get a decent deal on anything, and suddenly the market reeve. Imagine a combination of traffic warden, wrestling referee, and the nosiest neighbour you've ever had appears out of nowhere. The reeve is armed with a certified set of scales, a measuring stick, and a deep, abiding suspicion of every single person present. Try to sell an underweight loaf of bread, he'll spot it from 50 paces away. Water down your milk, he'll sniff it, then call over witnesses. If your cheese is too small, too large, or too disappointingly lumpy, you may be summoned for a public cheese inquest. A completely humiliating spectacle involving lots of pointing, shouting, and the ceremonial dropping of the suspect cheese into a bucket of water to see if it floats. If it sinks, you're declared innocent. Unless, of course, the Reeves brother-in-law owns the rival cheese stall. Don't even think about undercutting your competitors. Market law demands everyone stick to the official price, and breaking it is a guaranteed one-way ticket to being pelted with root vegetables or forced to pay a fine large enough to make you seriously rethink your entire life. Worse, word will spread, and you'll forever be that cheese cheat haunted by constant whispers of mouldy scandal. Meanwhile, the crowd flows around you in unpredictable tides. Someone sharply steps on your foot. A chicken suddenly makes a break for freedom, pursued by 3 screaming children and an apprentice baker wielding a large rolling pin. You narrowly dodge a bucket of live eels, only to collide violently with a neighbour's wheelbarrow full of suspiciously large radishes. Market day is part gladiator pit, part daily soap opera. Oh, and every so often, the entire frantic affair screeches to a complete halt for the official arrival of a dignitary, the turnip inspector, or sometimes the dreaded ale taster. These officials take their work very, very seriously. The turnip inspector will prod, sniff, and occasionally verbally threaten your produce with exile if it doesn't measure up to his standards. The ale taster, meanwhile, has the enviable task of sampling every single brew in the market, a job he manages with an air of both deep professional responsibility and profound tipsiness. Bartering is also rampant and rarely straightforward. Need eggs but only brought onions? Congratulations, you've just entered into a complex 5-way negotiation involving a goat, 3 hanks of rough wool, and a solemn promise not to say anything about last week's scandalous pie incident. Markets are where secrets, rumours, and impromptu marriage proposals are exchanged at a much faster rate than any actual currency. By the time you've survived the day, you'll have lost a shoe, gained a single turnip, and completely forgotten why you came in the first place. The cheese you finally walk away with, it's slightly overpriced, probably a little sweaty, and absolutely the best thing you will taste all week. So, next time you complain about standing in line at the grocery store, just remember, at least no one is measuring your carrots with a suspicious glare or threatening you with a floating cheese test. Survival in the Tudor market is a brutal art, and sometimes a minor miracle. Forget simply keeping your elbows off the table. Using the wrong kind of knife at a Tudor dinner could easily get you socially executed. Dinner is a rigorous test of etiquette, nerves, and raw jaw strength. Don't forget, always wipe your hands on the designated tablecloth, never on the person next to you, and always beware of any pies that appear to be singing. Let's get the table set. You walk into the enormous Great Hall, carefully ducking under various ancestral banners and the suspicious gaze of 3 different portraits of the host's ancestors, each one silently judging your posture and manners. The aroma is intense and overwhelming. Roasted meats, pungent herbs, fresh bread, and something mysterious wafting from the far end of the table that might be either fish or a failed taxidermy experiment. Every single seat is precisely assigned because in Tudor England, where you sit reveals everything: who you are, who you know, and whether you are even allowed to cut your own bread with the fancy knife. Etiquette is the supreme law. You only take your seat when the head of the house sits down, and you must not, under any circumstance, start nibbling before the first mandatory toast, which is usually delivered by someone with a long title, an expensive wig, and a dangerously wobbly goblet. The servants circulate with large platters, and you silently pray you'll get more than a chunk of boiled turnip or whatever was scraped out of last week's old pottage. The boldest patrons dare the singing pie, a traditional Tudor banquet spectacle where live birds are baked into the pastry's shell, then freed at the table to delight every diner. Honestly, nothing welcomes you quite like a startled stork in your soup. Now, about cutlery. Yes, forks do exist. but choosing one instantly brands you as suspiciously continental. Spoons and knives are the accepted standard, preferably your own set, carried from home and tucked into your belt, like a personalised culinary sabre. Picking the wrong blade is a huge blunder that could tarnish your standing for many seasons. Carve your meat too aggressively and you're instantly labelled a savage. Slice with too much grace, and you're clearly trying to hide noble lineage or a guilty conscience. For refreshment, you'll drink ale, wine, or for the truly adventurous mead, all served in thick mugs that work perfectly as self-defense weapons during sudden disagreements over who exactly owns the northern pasture. Toasts are frequent, and they demand enthusiasm. Failing to participate makes you a suspect, perhaps plotting treason or at best concealing a deep secret. Overindulge and the tavern keeper will remember you eternally. The tablecloth serves more than just decoration, it's practically your only hope for hand cleanliness. Wipe your fingers subtly because using it to blow your nose is absolutely forbidden. Even if your Uncle Geoffrey appears to have missed that crucial memo. Bread functions both as your food and your napkin. Just be careful not to drop any crumbs, or the family dog will view that as an open challenge. If you're fortunate enough to receive meat, you must pass the platter in the approved direction. Pass left, never right, unless you're dining with a whole group of left-handed aristocrats, which frankly means you've likely stumbled into the wrong celebration. Under no circumstance should you ever lick your knife, chew the bone to a nub, or, heaven save us, stab your portion. These are all crimes against fine dining and could earn you a severe lecture, a hefty penalty, or the ultimate humiliation, being seated at the children's table next time, where, let's be real, the chatter is almost always better. Table conversation is another dangerous zone. Discussing politics is risky, religion is even more so, and any comment about your host's latest haircut is outright perilous. Gossip is fine, provided you keep it one scandal in the past. Nobody wants to be the one accused of spreading a fresh rumour before the dessert course. When the meal finally concludes, you only rise after the host stands, bow or curtsy at least twice, and pray you've made it through without causing a major incident. If you've survived the whole thing without dropping your spoon, drinking from the wrong goblet, or getting pecked by a released magpie, consider it a victory. You're practically a member of the nobility, so the next time you eat in front of the TV, spare a little thought for the Tudors. Their table was a high-stakes stage, the audience brutal, and the very dinner roll might have been weaponized. Enjoy your meal. Pet ownership in Tudor England isn't just a lifestyle. It's a constant legal challenge. Dogs must wear muzzles, pigs need leashes, and if your rooster crows during unsanctioned hours, expect a stiff reprimand from the mayor's office or a mob of angry neighbours. Let's start with the dogs. If you're imagining a devoted golden retriever, think again. Most Tudor animals are kept for a clear purpose: herding livestock, killing rodents, or acting as your early warning alarm for tax collectors. Yet, even these industrious companions come loaded with regulations. In major towns, rules mandate dogs be muzzled, particularly during outbreaks of rabies, or, as the Tudors called it, mad dog season. If your dog was discovered unmuzzled or worse, snapping at a neighbour's heel, you might be fined, have the animal seized, or be forced to sit through a lengthy sermon on community responsibility. Small lapdogs, favoured by the wealthy, were technically allowed to roam, but only if they sported the proper ribbon, a clear sign of the owner's rank and the dog's complete lack of utility. Now, pigs. If you owned one, congratulations. You had the equivalent of a mobile savings account, a central heat source, and an organic garbage disposal all bundled into one. Unfortunately, so did most of your neighbours, which is why Tudor communities were full of loose swine rooting through waste, digging up flower beds, and occasionally terrorising local vendors. To minimise the chaos and keep the gardens safe, laws required that all urban pigs be fitted with a nose ring and led on a leash, ideally by someone strong enough to restrain them when they got distracted by an interesting smell, which in Tudor times was everything. Fail to leash your pig and you risked more than just dirty looks. The town swineherd could legally confiscate your animal and charge you a fee for its return, a medieval version of posting bail for your four-legged delinquent. Repeated offenders might see their pigs carted away to the Lord Mayor's pig pound, where the creatures would await a verdict, their fate decided by a jury of grumpy aldermen and one incredibly bored clerk. Roosters were yet another source of civic disruption. They are not naturally considerate housemates, and Tudor authorities had regulations about when and how often they were allowed to crow. A rooster that managed to wake the mayor before dawn could earn you a fine, a visit from the local constable, or a place of shame on the village's most hated list, right under the guy who never returns borrowed carts. Constant crowing could even get your bird formally banned from the town limits, which was awkward for everyone involved. Cats, meanwhile, were tolerated for their mouse-hunting talents but viewed with deep suspicion, especially if they were black or enjoyed lingering around elderly women with strange gardens. Keeping too many cats was a direct route to being labelled a witch, or at least highly peculiar. Dogs retrieved sticks. Cats, it seemed, retrieved gossip and accusations of sorcery. Even working animals were regulated. Horses had to be properly stabled, and if yours was caught wandering the main road, you could expect a fine and a sarcastic comment about your horsemanship from the local reeve. Cows and sheep grazing in the wrong field led to angry, lengthy letters written in legal Latin, which mostly just meant control your livestock or face the consequences. And then there were the exotic pets. Occasionally, a wealthy merchant might import a monkey, a parrot, or even a tortoise to impress guests at dinner parties. These creatures required special permits, and in one notorious instance, an official decree was issued when a monkey was found drinking ale and gambling with dice in a local tavern. True story, the monkey won. These animal-related laws weren't just about public safety. They were a subtle way of ensuring everyone knew their social position. Rich people kept peacocks and riding ponies. Poor people had pigs and problems. Breaking these rules wasn't simply a bother. It was a social declaration, and often a costly one. So next time your neighbour complains about your dog's barking, just remember, at least you don't need a leash for your pig, a muzzle for your chicken, or have to worry about your cat being tried for sorcery. Tudor England, where every animal came with a footnote, and every footnote probably ended with a penalty. The Tudors considered bedtime a serious affair, so serious in fact that you could be fined for lighting a candle after curfew. If you're caught reading after the sun sets, anticipate a tax notice, a public scolding, and possibly a visit from the official snuffer. Let's set the scene. The sun disappears behind the roof lines, bathing the world in that distinctive Tudor evening light. Muddy pathways, smoking chimneys, and the soft grunt of your neighbour struggling to corral their pig home. At the bell's chime, 9 or maybe 10 if you're lucky, the town crier slowly shuffles down the street in his best hat, ringing his bell and announcing loudly, "Lights out, curfew." This is not a suggestion, it's a royal mandate. Every homeowner is expected to extinguish their candles, bank their fireplace, and get into bed, as if the king himself might drop in for an inspection. Why such early nights? For one, candles were expensive. A single beeswax candle cost more than a day's pay for most people, and even the simple tallow candle made from animal fat smelled faintly of burnt regret and stained your walls a sophisticated shade of brown. Keeping one lit after curfew wasn't just suspicious, it was seen as wasteful extravagance. The Crown, always seeking new ways to raise revenue, instituted an actual candle tax. If you wanted to stay up past your bedtime, you had to pay up. No one wanted to be caught by the tax collector trying to explain why they were reading late, especially if the book was on the list of suspiciously educational texts. And the official snuffer, yes, that was a genuine job title, one poor soul tasked with patrolling streets and peering into windows to catch rule breakers mid-chapter. Get caught with an illegal candle and you'd receive a lecture on fire prevention, a fine, and maybe a little public humiliation for good measure. Repeat offenders could even lose their precious candle rations, forcing them to rely on the moonlight, neighbourhood gossip, or the faint glow of their own embarrassment. Curfew wasn't only about saving wax or collecting taxes, it was primarily about control. Night was the prime time for mischief makers, criminals, and anyone with enough free time to plot a rebellion. The government reasoned that the most effective way to prevent nighttime crime was to ensure everyone was safely in bed, preferably asleep. If you were caught outdoors after curfew, you were automatically assumed to be up to no good. Perhaps a thief, a spy, or, worst of all, someone from the next village. Inside, bedtime was a complex custom. Parents hurried children into their communal straw beds, while adults settled in with nightcaps and prayers. You dared not light another candle unless you enjoyed the smell of heated lard and the looming threat of a fine. Most evenings you went to bed early, not necessarily from exhaustion, but because the darkness compelled it. It's difficult to gossip, sew, or even plot your neighbour's downfall in absolute darkness. Of course, people found ways to beat the system. Some households maintained secret stashes of rushlights, homemade torches of reeds dipped in grease, hidden in bread ovens or behind loose hearthstones. A good rushlight might give you 15 minutes of faint, flickering light, just enough time to finish a bit of embroidery, whisper a juicy secret, or check your toes hadn't frozen off. Occasionally, rebellious folks would stay up late playing cards, reading forbidden pamphlets, or simply enjoying the soft golden light of their smuggled candle. But the fear of the snuffer, the fines and the rumours kept most people compliant. After all, nobody wanted to be labelled a midnight troublemaker. Reputation was vital in Tudor England, and you never knew who might be peeking through your shutters. So, as you curl up under your blanket, be grateful for your bedside lamp and the distinct lack of official snuffers patrolling your hallway. In Tudor times, the cost of one late-night page-turner could be a week's wages, a public shaming, and a house that smelled suspiciously of singed mutton. Sleep soundly and don't let the snuffer get you. No matter how late you argued about turnips, you were expected to be in church on Sunday morning. Your absence is subject to fines, public humiliation, or worse, being mistaken for a secret Catholic. You also better look attentive during the sermon. Dozing off is a definite gamble. Picture the scene. Sunday arrives, grey and chilly, and your entire household starts the weekly rush. Nobody gets to sleep in. Not you, not your kids, not even the family pig, who probably needs to be locked in the shed to prevent an embarrassing breakout. Your only hope is to get dressed, achieve a semblance of cleanliness, and arrive before the church bell starts ringing. And don't even consider sneaking in the back. The church warden is watching, and he has the seating arrangement memorised. Attendance is not optional in Tudor England. Church is the focal point of community life, a mandatory event where being absent is as conspicuous as wearing velvet when you're a commoner. Miss too many services and you'll be hit with a fine. Usually a few pennies, but enough to hurt. If you're truly unlucky, your absence will be announced publicly from the pulpit, guaranteeing a week's worth of sideways glances from neighbours and whispers about your questionable faith. Repeat offenders risk public penance, which means standing at the front of the church in a unique shame sheet, or even a session in the stocks where local children are encouraged to throw stale bread and creative insults. Inside, the church is cold, draughty, and smells like aged wood, incense, and a slight hint of sheep. Seating is rigidly ranked. The gentry and dignitaries sit up front. Everyone else is squeezed onto hard benches or standing in the aisles. Don't even think about claiming a better seat. That's another rule, and a social infraction that will get you excluded from every future Barnaby dance. The service itself is long. The priest speaks monotonously, cycling between Bible readings, royal decrees, and subtle reminders not to gossip, poach local rabbits, or skip church. Your primary task is to appear engaged, say Amen at the right times, and above all, stay awake. Fall asleep? And you might be poked by the parish beetle, a man equipped with a long staff specifically for this purpose. There's no better way to be reminded of your spiritual obligations than being whacked on the head with a brass knob. If you manage to survive without embarrassment, you're still not completely safe. Church is also where you settle your tithes, 1/10 of everything you own, from your best turnip to your last chicken egg. Try to skimp, and the church warden will pay you a visit, carrying a suspiciously large bag. Forget your tithe entirely, and you might find yourself the subject of a public prayer requesting divine help for your memory. And then there's the all-seeing scrutiny of your neighbours. Church is the crucial place to see and be seen. Who's walking with whom, who's wearing brand new shoes, who's been crying, and who's trying desperately to conceal a black eye from Saturday night. The real sermon is delivered by the village gossips, who take mental notes on everyone's conduct, ready to share their findings over a Monday morning bucket of laundry. Finally, as the service concludes and everyone exits, there's a gauntlet of handshakes, polite acknowledgements, and well-meaning inquiries about your health, your garden, and whether you've thought about joining the church choir. Don't be shocked if the vicar corners you to remind you about the next holy day, or if your neighbour hints, not so subtly, that your singing could use more enthusiasm. By the time you get home, you're exhausted, a little poorer, and already dreading next Sunday. But whatever you do, don't miss it, unless you prefer a fine public shame or rumours about your secret loyalty to Rome. In Tudor England, everyone makes it to church, even if they leave their dignity at the door. Growing a beard in Tudor England is a deeply political statement. Beards of a certain length were subject to a tax. Shaving could get you labelled as a radical, and pity the man caught with an unlicensed moustache. Yes, those were a real thing. Let's be frank, in Tudor England, your chin wasn't just your personal business, it was the Crown's business. Facial hair was far more than a style choice. It was a statement, a tax bracket, and occasionally a minor legal issue. Every morning began with a decision. Do you shave and risk gossip, or let it grow and risk a visit from the local beard inspector? Yes, that was an official position. Imagine trying to look intimidating while holding a ruler up to the town blacksmith's face. The regulations, as usual, depended heavily on your social status. Nobles dictated the fashion. If the king was sporting a beard, and at times Henry VIII's chin bristles were the talk of all Europe, then all loyal subjects immediately grew their own, hoping to win royal favour or at least avoid being accused of favouring the French. But too much beard, and suddenly you were mistaken for a dissenter, a Puritan, or worst of all, a philosopher. It was complicated by the fact that Tudor facial hair was governed by a mess of constantly shifting laws and royal fancies. For most of Elizabeth I's reign, beards longer than 2 weeks of growth incurred a beard tax. The prevailing logic was that the longer your beard, the more money you must have to splurge on razors, oils, and the time-consuming grooming rituals only the wealthy could afford. To prove you had paid your dues, you received an official beard token, essentially a receipt to attach to your clothing, and perhaps even your facial hair. Lose it, and you could face a fine or worse, a public shaving administered by the local constable, whose experience with sharp blades rarely went beyond shearing sheep. And don't get smug if you were clean-shaven. In some social circles, a bare chin was a telltale sign of a troublemaker. Maybe you were a covert Catholic, a radical religious reformer, or just someone with a weak jawline. Either way, you risked being whispered about at the alehouse. Did you notice Thomas? No beard. He probably writes poetry and has foreign notions about dinner forks. Then there were the moustaches. Oh, the moustaches. Sporting a dramatic moustache without the necessary documentation, yes, truly, could get you in serious trouble. Some cities demanded an upper lip licence, acquired from the local guild or bailiff. Without it, you were presumed to be impersonating a soldier, or worse, an actor. And we all know how the populace felt about actors, exciting on the stage, highly suspicious off it. Barbers, meanwhile, were the true power players of the face. They not only trimmed hair, pulled teeth and patched wounds, but also served as unofficial beard consultants, tracking who was growing what and who might need a quiet warning about the latest law. If you lacked a trusted barber, you needed an extremely steady hand, or you risked uneven sideburns, an offence against both God and good taste. It wasn't only men who faced scrutiny. Women too had their own follicular standards. Eyebrows had to be shaped just right, thick enough to suggest virtue, thin enough not to suggest witchcraft. Pluck too much, and the village might wonder if you were hiding something. Don't pluck at all, and you'd be accused of laziness or, even worse, continental sensibilities. Ultimately, keeping your face legally acceptable was a daily balancing act of scissors, suspicion, and social signalling. One wrong move and you were fined, shamed, or forced to listen to the vicar's sermon on the dangers of vanity. If you were lucky, you'd escape with nothing worse than a patchy beard and a new understanding of why so many Tudor portraits look like the subject is worried about being arrested mid-painting. So, the next time you admire your stubble or think about a new style, remember, in Tudor England, your facial hair wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a matter of law, and the law always had a ruler ready. Thinking of running off with the blacksmith's daughter? Not so fast. Tudor marriage is a bureaucratic ordeal. Marrying without the proper paperwork can land both of you in serious trouble. It's a Romeo and Juliet story, but with significantly more documents and fewer dramatic endings. First, forget about spontaneous romantic proposals. In Tudor England, romance is a multi-stage operation involving half the community and various legal papers. The church keeps meticulous records, and marriage is less about fresh flowers and more about wealth, alliances, and making sure nobody is secretly a French spy. The initial stage is publishing the banns, a public declaration of your intent to marry. This is read out during church services for 3 Sundays in a row. It's not just tradition, it's an early warning system for meddling neighbours. Anyone with a grudge or a hazy memory of you kissing the baker's apprentice can stand up and object. Did you once steal a turnip? Now is the time for the entire village to remember. Even after you've survived the public bans, there's paperwork. If you're in a hurry, maybe you can't wait the full 3 weeks, or perhaps someone is already knitting a suspiciously small pair of socks, you'll need a special marriage licence. Getting one means a trek to the nearest bishop's office, explaining yourself to a clerk who has heard every possible excuse, and of course, paying a fee. The bishop needs to ensure you aren't already married, too closely related, or involved in any heretical activities like planning to wed without the right paperwork. Social class complicates everything even further. If you're a peasant, you require your local lord's permission. If you come from a family with means, expect your parents to draft a detailed contract, negotiate dowries, and confirm the in-laws won't try to claim your best cow. Sometimes, marriages are arranged while the couple is still in their infancy. Convenient if you like long-term planning, awkward if you grow up to despise each other's choice in hats. Secret marriages certainly happen, but they are an enormous gamble. Getting caught marrying without a license or outside of a church, say beneath a romantic oak tree or in a barn, can result in huge fines, annulment, or public penance. The priest might be forced to declare your union invalid, and you'll spend the next few Sundays standing in the church porch wearing a distinctive shame smock. The Tudor version of a walk of shame, complete with more mud and no one cheering you on. The church's concern is not purely moral. Marriages that bypass official channels threaten property rights and inheritance laws, which means the Crown could miss out on tax revenue. If you inherit land from your spouse but your marriage is unofficial, the property might go back to the local lord, or, worse, the Crown. The paperwork is not merely for fun. It's to make absolutely certain every sheep, every spoon, and every child ends up exactly where the authorities expect. Love matches are infrequent, but not impossible. Sometimes a couple genuinely falls for each other and manages to persuade their families, the vicar, the mayor, and probably the local turnip inspector to grant their blessing. When it works, there's music, dancing, and enough food to make the neighbours envious for weeks. But even at the reception, rules are everywhere. Who can offer a toast to whom, what shade the bride is permitted to wear, and whether the pies are legal. See the Great Pie Scandal. If anyone spontaneously recites poetry, everyone pretends not to notice. It's the safer option. And if you ever find yourself wishing for a secret midnight wedding, remember, Tudor villages are tiny. Gossip travels faster than the church bell, and the parish clerk's ink is permanent. So next time you think about eloping, spare a moment for the Tudor romantics. Their love stories might not have ended with poison or tragic duels, but they did have to survive the most deadly weapon of all, bureaucracy. Serving a pie with too little meat or, God forbid, fake ingredients was a punishable offence. Pie inspectors roamed the streets, seriously, and would not hesitate to take legal action against your soggy bottom. Let's be honest, in Tudor England, pies were more than just a meal. They were a question of public confidence, national identity, and, if you were a meat pastry enthusiast, a risky act of social defiance. If your pie was mostly crust and light on filling, you weren't just disappointing your guests, you were tempting fate and inviting a visit from the terrifying pie inspector. Yes, that was an actual job description. Picture a person whose entire life purpose is to investigate whether your mutton pie contains more mystery than meat. The ultimate covert agent, except they are armed with a fork and a profound distrust of turnips. Pie law was no joke. Strict statutes dictated the minimum amount of meat required per pie. Woe to anyone who attempted to pass off a stew-filled pastry as the genuine article. In some communities, beef, lamb, or pork were the only acceptable fillings. If you dared to use peacock, squirrel, or, heaven preserve you, shoe leather disguised by a thick sauce, you could find yourself publicly shamed, fined, or even banned from market day for a whole month. The shame of missing market day could only be surpassed by the horror of trying to explain to your mother-in-law why your pie was suspiciously chewy. So, how did these rules play out in daily life? Imagine yourself baking in a smoky Tudor kitchen, anxiously watching the oven and desperately trying to recall whether parsnips count as acceptable bulk. You followed the recipe precisely, or as close as you could get, when half your flour was borrowed from the neighbour. But the nagging fear remains, is there truly enough meat? What if the inspector shows up just as you're cutting into your masterpiece? You picture the scene. He strides in, flour-dusted and frowning, demanding a sample. He prods, he weighs, he pokes. Too much pastry, insufficient filling. He solemnly writes your fate in a small leather-bound ledger. The punishments for a botched pie ranged from mild to life-altering. Sometimes it was just a small fine and a public confession. I, John the baker, solemnly swear I will never again attempt to pass off a carrot as a beef shank. Other times, your pie might be confiscated and fed to the pigs, a destiny almost as bad as being fed to the pigs yourself. If you were a repeat offender, your name could end up on a list of suspect bakers, a culinary scarlet letter. Mothers would point you out to their children in the street. There goes the man who once sold a pie filled with turnip and sorrow. And don't think you could get clever and just serve a smaller portion. Size regulations were also enforced, with specific pie tins issued by the guild. Using a counterfeit crust was regarded as an act of culinary fraud. Some bakers tried hiding surprises inside, small birds, coins, or the occasional frog, just to spice things up. But if you neglected to declare your pie extras, you risked being labelled a food saboteur. No one wants to explain to the town bailiff why there's a live sparrow under the crust. The upside? When you finally got a proper Tudor pie, golden, aromatic, loaded with meat, and just enough onions to ward off the village gossips, it was a sight to behold. Pies brought communities together, sustained armies, and earned royal favour. Just one excellent pie could boost your reputation for months. Get it wrong, though, and you'd be living down Peagate until the next plague rolled through. So the next time you take a frozen pie out of your oven, thank your stars you're not facing the scrutiny of a Tudor pie inspector. In the world of Old English baking, the only thing harder than the crust was the law. Forget accidentally letting a curse word slip out. Swearing in Tudor England could land you in the stocks. There were actual laws detailing which words were fineable and how much they'd cost you. Just pray nobody heard you mutter, "By God's wounds," after stubbing your toe. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. Your vocabulary was under government observation. Tudor England didn't just disapprove of crude language, they wrote entire legal statutes about it. They had profanity police, local officials tasked with listening for blasphemy and keeping detailed records of who said what, when, and just how creative you got with your insults. It was like living with your grandmother, your boss, and a court stenographer all at once. The most perilous language wasn't what we'd consider a four-letter word today. No, the gravest offences involved taking the Lord's name in vain. Expressions like "by God's bones," "by the Mass," or "God's blood" were seen as literal acts of sacrilege, small rebellions against the divine order. Just yelling "zounds," a contraction of God's wounds, after stepping on a rake could cost you a fine equal to a week's wages and, depending on the magistrate's mood, a humiliating session in the public stocks for good measure. Imagine having to explain to your neighbours why you're seated on a wooden bench getting pelted with stale turnips. I coughed and felt the sudden weight of sin. Not every casual curse word carried the same price. The penalties were meticulously scaled, a formal tariff of taboo language matched with corresponding fines. Simple outbursts might only cost a penny or two, but habitual or especially colourful profanity was viewed as proof of a dangerously rebellious mind. Those who blasphemed could face the pillory, their necks and wrists locked in a wooden cage for hours, while the devout and children pelted them with hard bread and self-righteous advice. Reform, John, and pay closer attention to your vowels next time. Naturally, this strict regulation gave rise to a bustling underground of euphemism. Tudors became masters at delivering savage comments without technically breaking the law. Instead of cursing by God's bones, folks mumbled odds bodikins. God's teeth evolved into zooks. If you ever wondered where the renowned British linguistic creativity began, look no further than a populace desperate to insult their livestock without incurring a clergyman's wrath. Even Shakespeare himself joined in, constructing layers of innuendo and mockery so dense you could safely malign the Queen's horse in perfect iambic pentameter. The Church and the State took foul language so seriously that chronic offenders were sometimes forced into public penance. This often involved standing barefoot in the church entrance, wearing a simple white shift and loudly confessing your verbal transgressions. It's one thing to let a curse slip in a fit of pique. It's quite another to recite your greatest hits before a gathered assembly with nothing to do but evaluate your delivery. For the particularly ill-fated, records of their foul mouths were preserved for future generations. Imagine your great-grandchildren reading how you were fined for inventing "by all the devils of toenails" on a soggy Tuesday. Yet even with such rigid rules, human nature finds a way. Kids picked up banned terms from the docks and repeated them at home, earning a soap-flavoured scolding. Alehouses were breeding grounds for inventive swearing, with innkeepers conveniently pretending not to hear, unless, of course, the official swearing inspector happened to be enjoying a nearby ale. The nobility often received lighter treatment, shielded by their status and a generous interpretation of their pious intentions. If the local duke accidentally cursed during a tense croquet match, everyone quickly agreed he must have meant "by the saints" all along. So, next time you trip and mutter something regrettable, be glad that the only thing at risk is your self-respect, and maybe a disapproving glance from your cat. In Tudor England, your words were never just air, they were legal evidence, and the law was always listening. Watch your mouth. Want bacon? Too bad. The Crown and Church mandated long periods without meat. If you're caught cheating, it's public humiliation and a fine. Prepare for a Lent where the only thing thinner than your patience is your pottage. Let's start the tale. It's early spring in Tudor England. The weather is a chaotic mix of damp, cold, and general gloom, and Lent has begun. Just to ensure your last winter comforts are removed precisely when you need them most, 40 days of culinary austerity await. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. Just the slow, watery march of pottage and, if you're lucky, a herring that's already seen better days. Enforcing these fasting rules is a deadly serious business. Local officials and church wardens are actively patrolling, making snap inspections and sniffing out any home where the chimney smoke smells a little too much like roast. If you're discovered cooking so much as a suspiciously plump turnip, expect to be summoned to the church entrance, where you'll confess your greasy transgressions in front of your hungry, disapproving neighbours. Gossip spreads like wildfire. I hear old Mrs. Barton had chicken broth on the 3rd Tuesday of Lent. Suddenly, she's the village sensation, and everyone's quietly wondering what she'd charge for a single spoonful. Of course, the rules are complex. This is, after all, Tudor England. Some days you can have fish, some days only certain types. And if you're sufficiently important, or just friends with the vicar, there's a convenient list of loopholes involving barnacle geese and beaver tails. Yes, you heard correctly. The Tudors classified barnacle geese and beavers as fish because they lived near water, and more importantly, everyone was desperate for any semblance of flavour. Beaver tail. It's what's for dinner. The Sunday roast, a vital component of the English soul, becomes a distant, meaty memory. Instead, your family is gathered around a bowl of something that began as lentils and ended up as pure resentment. Bread, stripped of eggs and butter, becomes hard and unappetizing. The only fat you encounter is in the sermons about resisting temptation. The local ale is weaker, the cheese is forbidden, and everyone is checking each other for signs of illicit pork breath. Temptation is everywhere. The marketplace is a dangerous place. Vendors quietly talk about secret pies, smoked hams, and the rare black market sausage. The risks are high, but the reward is greater. One tiny bite of forbidden pork is enough to make you feel both a hero and a fugitive. Some households get innovative, stuffing vegetables with fish, inventing new variations of herring pudding and brewing Lenten-friendly small beer so diluted that even the family goat turns its nose up at it. If you're caught, justice is swift and theatrical. Public penance could mean wearing a distinctive garment, sitting on the sinner's bench, or, for the particularly greedy, being forced to parade a suspiciously plump chicken through the market while loudly proclaiming your devotion to fish. Fines are handed out, gossip explodes, and your household's reputation for piety plummets. The nobility, as always, finds ways to bend the rules. If you're wealthy, you can afford exemptions, imported fish, medically necessary meat broth, or a helpful letter from a bishop excusing you due to delicate health, also known as deep pockets. For the majority, Lent is about endurance, resourcefulness, and a lot of wistful staring at chickens. Eventually, Easter arrives. Bells ring, the feasts return, and the aroma of roasting meat fills the air as every pent-up appetite explodes at once. The pious thank God, the rest thank the pig. Until next year, when Lent returns with all its culinary vengeance. So, next time you think about skipping breakfast, remember the Tudors. 40 days of public fasting, creative deception, and soup so clear you could read your list of sins through it. Enjoy your meal, if you dare. The streets are full of the undeserving poor, and Tudor law had a category for every kind of beggar, vagrant, or rogue. Step out of line, and you could find yourself whipped, branded, or marched off to the nearest workhouse without any questions. Let's take a walk down the high street. You haven't gone 10 feet before a one-eyed Abraham man accosts you, rattling a wooden cup and mumbling a story about losing his foot. Don't look too closely at the suspiciously foot-shaped bundle under his cloak. A short distance away, a clapper-dudgeon hobbles by, dramatically waving a bandaged arm and reciting poetry for coppers. If you suspect the performance is a little too convincing, you're right. There were actual guidebooks for beggars, detailing the best pity stories and instructions on how to fake a believable limp. In Tudor England, acting wasn't just for the theatre, it was an essential street survival skill. Naturally, the authorities kept precise records of who was begging, why, and for how long. There were licensed beggars, usually the elderly, the sick, or those truly down on their luck. These unfortunates received a badge or permit from the parish, giving them the legal right to rattle their cups. Everyone else, the able-bodied, the suspiciously healthy, or those with too much theatrical talent, were labelled sturdy beggars, vagabonds, or masterless men, and treated with ill-disguised contempt. Tudor lawmakers believed poverty should be managed, not pitied. They categorised the poor as either deserving, quiet, grateful, preferably tragic, or undeserving, loud, fit, or caught sleeping in a barn that wasn't theirs. Laws like the Vagabonds Act of 1572 listed over 20 types of rogue, from the ruffler, an ex-soldier with a habit of threats, to the counterfeit crank, a fake epileptic who foamed at the mouth using soap shavings. The punishments were severe and imaginative. If caught begging without a licence, you could be publicly whipped, branded with a hot iron, a V for vagrant, which for social networking is worse than being banned from the alehouse, or marched to the nearest parish boundary and ordered never to return. Some unlucky people were forced into labour at the local workhouse, breaking rocks, spinning wool, or learning there is such a thing as too much gruel. Still, rogues and beggars were a reality of Tudor life, and many towns tolerated their presence with a mixture of fear, pity, and annoyance. Locals might discreetly slip a coin to a favourite street performer or secretly leave bread for the old woman who told fortunes by the market cross. But woe to any vagrant caught fighting, stealing, or, God forbid, running a scam on a Sunday. Sundays were reserved for church penance and the local constable polishing his branding iron. Children were also swept into the system. Idle youth could be seized and apprenticed to tradesmen or farmers, who were supposed to turn them into useful members of society or, failing that, at least keep them out of the taverns. Sometimes these kids ran off, joining the wandering groups of Egyptians, early slang for Roma people, fortune-tellers, and other outsiders who travelled from town to town, constantly one step ahead of the law and the nearest angry landowner. So next time you drop a coin in a cup or avoid a street performer, remember that in Tudor England, begging wasn't just a job. It was a risky career path with its own rules, uniforms and dangers. One wrong step and you could transform from a masterless man to a marked rogue overnight. And if you ended up on the wrong side of the law, let's just say there were no appeal forms, just a long journey and a sore backside. Thinking of a new career? You'd better check with the guild first. Every profession comes with a rule book thicker than the bread. Apprentices could be punished for whistling, sleeping late, or daring to look too happy. Let's say you're looking for a new trade. Perhaps you've had enough of pig herding, or you're ready to exchange the glamorous world of dung sweeping for the brutal life of a candlemaker. First stop, the guild. These weren't simply trade unions. They were medieval mega-clubs with fierce loyalty, secret handshakes, and an almost religious dedication to bylaws. The guilds controlled everything: who could work, who could open a shop, and most importantly, who got to wear the most impressive hat. To become a master, you start as an apprentice. This involves at least 7 years of learning, beginning as a naive youngster and ending as someone who's seen more cheese mould than daylight. Your master is both a mentor and a drill sergeant. Arrive late? That's more chores. Complain about tired feet? That's 2 more hours of sweeping. Smile too much? Clearly, you're plotting something. Apprenticeship isn't merely about acquiring a skill. It's about mastering the art of silent endurance. Every job had its rules, and not just about how to make ale or stitch shoes. There were rules about how you dressed, clean, simple, and never more expensive than your master's. How you spoke, respectfully, and preferably with fewer vowels if you were an apprentice. And even how you walked, no swagger, no skipping, and under no circumstances should you dance in public. There were also endless, complicated rituals, annual feasts, inspection days, and parades where everyone desperately tried not to trip over their own ceremonial aprons. Breaks were less official and more of a creative interpretation of workplace health and safety. There wasn't much actual tea. Tudor England was still decades away from that particular obsession, but breaks for ale, bread, or simply staring longingly out the window were vital to the medieval workday. The master might seem gruff, but he understood that productivity increased when the apprentices weren't passed out from boredom or hunger. There was always at least one apprentice whose main duty was to fetch food and gossip from the nearest market. This is how workplace drama was delivered, slightly cold, stale, and with a side of rumours about the miller's new apprentice. The guild kept a sharp eye on product quality. A poorly made batch of boots or an oddly shaped jug meant your master got fined, and you got a lecture about bringing shame to the craft, and perhaps a thrown wooden spoon for effect. Competition among guilds was intense. Butchers, bakers, candle makers, and fishmongers all vied for status and customers, sometimes engaging in minor industrial espionage, peeking over the fence and stealing the neighbour's best pie recipe. Promotion to journeyman was a significant step, permitting you to travel and work for different masters. A journeyman was a day worker, paid daily, who travelled from town to town, gathering skills, experience, and an ever-growing list of resentments against every harsh master they'd encountered. If you were highly skilled and well-connected enough, you could submit your masterpiece to the guild, a chisel, a jug, or a perfect shoe. You would then pray they judged you worthy of joining the elite ranks. Mess it up, and you're back to fetching ale and keeping your aspirations hidden. Meanwhile, workplace safety essentially boiled down to try not to catch fire and don't lose your fingers. The only inspector was the master's wife, who had zero tolerance for bandaged apprentices cluttering up her kitchen. Overtime wasn't paid. It was what happened when a large order came in or when the guild needed extra hands for the annual "Why are we doing this again?" parade. So, next time you complain about office politics or pointless meetings, remember that in Tudor England you needed guild permission to sneeze. Apprentices were punished for enthusiasm, and the only thing longer than the workday was the list of things you couldn't do. Take a break, you've earned it. Just make sure the guild doesn't find out. Enjoy dancing. That'll be 1 shilling, please. Maypole dances and other celebrations were strictly controlled, and breaking curfew after a party was a direct route to the stocks or a stern talking to from your grandmother. You might picture Tudor merrymaking as a glorious riot of sound and colour, tankards overflowing, lutes playing, ribbons streaming, and peasants linking arms around the maypole. That's mostly accurate, but every jig, skip and step was overseen by a committee of nervous town elders, several stern-faced churchwardens, and at least one professional grump whose job was to ensure proper decorum. Want to dance? Fill out the right paperwork. Want to host a feast? Hope you have a permit, a sober witness, and at least 3 inspected pies. Public dancing, without official consent, wasn't just frowned upon. In many places, it was genuinely illegal, unless the church or town council granted special permission. Maypole dancing was sometimes banned outright, considered dangerously pagan or at minimum an open invitation to flirt, drink, and worst of all, stay up past curfew. If your village did allow a maypole, the pole itself was guarded like the crown jewels. Lose it to a rival village's pranksters or thieves, and you'd have to account for yourself to the vicar, the mayor, and every disappointed child within 5 miles. Even private gatherings were subject to scrutiny. Saints' days, harvest festivals, and weddings brought out the dancer in everyone, but always within legal limits. The ale conner might show up to test the drinks. The Lord of Misrule, appointed to supervise Christmas fun, was expected to ensure the festivities didn't escalate into genuine misrule. And heaven help you if you were caught Morris dancing without authorization. The ribbons, bells and face paint alone could earn you a severe warning for unlicensed revelry. Curfew, as always, loomed in the background. Dancing after dark? Now you were in real trouble. The town crier's bell was the musical signal that the party was over. Anyone still skipping through the streets after sunset risked a fine or a night in the stocks, where your dance partners could stop by and throw cabbages, both as a joke and as leftovers from the feast. The stocks were always placed in the most public locations, guaranteeing your humiliation was both extensive and unforgettable. The church definitely had its opinions. Certain dance forms, especially anything involving overly enthusiastic hand-holding or suspicious hip movement, were regarded as the devil's work. Priests delivered severe sermons about the perils of rhythmic motion, and for a period even clapping on holy days was officially discouraged. Yet because humans are humans, nothing could completely suppress the impulse to twirl a partner or stomp a foot. Secret dances sprung up in backyards, barns, and anywhere someone could keep a lookout for the local beadle. The cost of merrymaking wasn't purely legal. Festivities required a license here, a shilling there, and a discreet bribe to the village constable if things went on a little too long. Sometimes, all it took to end a party was a well-timed complaint from that neighbour who still hadn't forgiven you for last year's accidental maypole theft. Yet, despite the risks and rules, the Tudors continued to dance. Merrymaking was their way of showing their defiance to work, winter, and the never-ending flood of regulations. Games, feasts, and song brought the community together, sometimes in joyful harmony, sometimes in the collective shame of a shared hangover. So the next time you step onto a dance floor or throw a house party, remember you could be fined for unlicensed merriment, shamed for illegal twirling, and publicly scolded for after-hours revelry. And if your grandmother is watching, the consequences could be far worse. In Tudor England, dancing was always a little bit risky, but that's precisely what made it worth doing. Ever wanted to shake the Queen's hand? Terrible idea. Approaching royalty was a hazardous minefield of protocols, from how many times you could blink to where you were allowed to stand. Getting it wrong could lead to exile, imprisonment, or simply a lifetime of shame. Let's set the scene. You've been summoned to the royal court, or perhaps you've just wandered a bit too close to the Queen's procession. Your palms are sweaty, your heart is pounding, and you suddenly realise how little you know about proper bowing technique. Welcome to the terrifying world of Tudor royal etiquette, where every gesture was scrutinised by dozens of watchful courtiers. And if you make a mistake, the best you can hope for is to be quietly ignored for the rest of your life. First, the basics. You never, ever approach the monarch unless explicitly invited. If you see Her Majesty Elizabeth heading your way, you stop, step aside, and execute a curtsy or bow so deep it looks like a yoga pose. Eye contact is reserved for the bold or the terminally doomed, and under no circumstances should you ever attempt a handshake. Even accidentally brushing the royal sleeve could land you in deep trouble, preferably not in the Thames, though history suggests that was always a possibility. But even before you're within speaking distance, there's the issue of dress. Are you wearing the correct colours? The Queen had opinions. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Get it wrong at court, and you weren't just committing a fashion blunder, you were making a political statement. Too much velvet. Who does this person think they are, the Duke of Norfolk? Too little. Is this individual even clean? The safest approach is to look humble, look neat, and try not to trip on your own shoelaces. Next, consider the choreography. There's a strict protocol for how close you can stand. 3 paces for the nobility, further for commoners, and absolutely nowhere near for that guy who once sneezed during a royal audience. Even your breathing was supposed to be controlled, shallow, quiet, and absolutely odourless. Tudor Court was a place of heavy anxiety and even heavier perfumes. If you are actually granted an audience, you'll be thoroughly briefed on everything from how to address the monarch, Your Majesty, followed by as many flourishes as you can manage without collapsing, to how to exit the room, always backward, never turning your back, which often resulted in genuinely memorable courtly pile-ups. Forget to bow on the way out? Expect to be talked about for years, possibly in the next royal gossip pamphlet. Touching the Queen or even her robes was strictly forbidden, unless you were a chosen favourite or a physician called in for the ceremony known as the royal touch. This was an actual ritual believed to cure scrofula, or the king's evil, by the laying on of royal hands. For the afflicted, it was a miracle. For everyone else, it was a perfect reminder that even illnesses were opportunities for awkward physical closeness and complicated ceremony. For the average subject, the nearest you'd get to the royal presence was at a public procession or during the royal touch. If you accidentally coughed, sneezed, or fainted from excitement, you'd better hope no one noticed, or you'd spend the rest of your life as that guy who ruined the Queen's big day. Entire careers were made and destroyed based on the success or failure of a single beau. Then there were the unwritten rules. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't ask questions, especially about the royal hair, and absolutely never mention marriage unless you're ready for a 30-minute lecture or, in the case of Henry VIII, a sudden and dramatic career change. So, next time you meet a celebrity and can barely manage to take a selfie, remember that in Tudor England, proximity to the crown was more perilous than treason, and the rules changed faster than you could blink, just, hopefully, not more than the allowed number of times. Bow, smile and retreat with caution, because when it came to the royal touch, a little distance goes a long way. The Tudors loved their beer but despised it being watered down. There were actual ale tasters whose job was to sample your brew and fine you if it was found to be lacking. Get caught tampering with the foam and your social standing is ruined. Let's begin with the most important rule of Tudor life. Never trust an ale that looks suspiciously clear. Ale was the people's drink. Rich or poor, child or elder, water was primarily for washing or, in an emergency, for extinguishing fires, assuming you wanted to risk it. But ale was sacred. Brewed in homes, monasteries and taverns, it was the safest way to hydrate and the social glue that held the entire country together. It was also heavily regulated because if there was one thing a Tudor wouldn't tolerate, it was weak booze. Enter the ale taster, a respected and slightly feared figure in every town, part party crasher, part quality control, part local celebrity. His job, show up unannounced at any brewery, home or alehouse, and demand a sample. No one refused the ale taster unless they were asking for trouble or were hiding a suspicious barrel labelled "Special Reserve for the Pigs." The ale taster would lift his cup, sniff and swirl with great formality, sip and make a declaration that could determine the fate of your next month's business and your reputation for years. The rules were rigid. The price of ale was legally fixed, governed by the assize of bread and ale, a legal document thicker than a good mug of stout. Brewers caught watering down their beer, skimping on ingredients, or adding anything foreign, like a handful of mashed peas, the horror, faced heavy fines. Repeated offenders could be banned from selling ale or even publicly shamed by being forced to drink their own substandard brew. You haven't experienced humiliation until you've choked down your watery mistake while your neighbours pretend not to laugh. And it wasn't just beer. All goods in the marketplace were fair game for Tudor regulation. Wine with a suspicious vinegar aftertaste, bread bulked out with sawdust or chalk, butter stretched with soot. It all fell under the watchful eye of the food inspectors. Cheese, in particular, was a notorious offender. Cut a wheel of cheddar and find more straw than dairy? The cheese taster, yes, there was a cheese taster, would descend on your stall, wielding a special knife and the wrath of the dairy gods. But back to ale, because that's where the rules got personal. Good ale could make your tavern the centre of the village. Bad ale, you might as well hang a sign that reads "Lonely Forever." If word got out that your beer was flat, thin, or failed to inspire the appropriate level of village song, you were in serious trouble. The rumour of a disappointing pint spread faster than anything. For Tudor women, many of whom brewed ale for their families or as a side business, the stakes were high. Women brewers, called alewives, were sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially if their beer was too good, witchcraft, or too bad, scandal. An alewife's success depended on her secret recipe, her talent for sweet-talking the ale taster, and her ability to avoid accusations of watering down the goods on a rainy day. Punishments for food fraud ranged from shaming and fines to the pillory. More than one brewer found themselves locked in the stocks, forced to listen as passers-by critique their product and offered helpful recipes. Next time, try hops and less pond water. So next time you complain about stale bread or flat beer, remember, in Tudor England, food and drink were a matter of public honour. Inspectors roamed the streets. Your neighbours were constantly watching, and one watered-down ale could ruin your social standing faster than you could say cheers. Drink up. Just make sure there's an ale taster watching your back. The Tudors had a love for bizarre and inventive punishments. Public humiliation, pillories and stocks were just the beginning. There are records of people being pelted with cabbages for especially imaginative crimes. Good luck if your only offence was being from the next village. Step into any Tudor town square and you're guaranteed to see justice in action, or at least the medieval version, which valued humiliation and creativity just as much as deterrence. The stocks were a classic. 2 wooden planks with holes for your wrists and ankles, planted in the most public, muddiest part of town. Find yourself stuck there, and you could look forward to a parade of neighbours offering old jokes, moral instruction, and whatever produce they had on hand. Cabbages were a popular choice, heavy, cheap, and satisfyingly squishy. By noon, a perfectly aimed cabbage to the shins was a badge of honour for the local kids. Pillories took things a step further. Instead of just sitting, you stood with your head and hands trapped, forced to endure the elements and the relentless banter of passing merchants. People travelled for miles to see who was on display that week, and some towns even scheduled market days to coincide with public punishments just to boost attendance. It was a family event. Bring the kids, buy a pie, and pelt your neighbour with yesterday's vegetables. Not all punishments were so physical. For minor offences like grumbling about the church roof or selling bread with short weight, you might be sentenced to wear a sign describing your crime. Gossip, turnip cheat, pie offender. You'd have to parade around the village until your shame was sufficiently public. Some particularly unfortunate souls were made to stand barefoot in the church porch, wearing only their regrets and a shift, while parishioners filed past with pointed stares and gentle reminders about piety. And then there were the truly creative punishments. The cucking stool, or ducking stool, was reserved for scolds and so-called troublesome women, essentially anyone who talked back or refused to laugh at the bailiff's jokes. Offenders were strapped to a wooden chair and repeatedly dunked into the nearest pond, emerging colder, wetter, and supposedly chastened. Spectators cheered, bets were placed on how many dunks it would take to cool someone's temper, and the local eel population enjoyed a sudden influx of visitors. If you thought the Tudors were above playground-style justice, think again. Being from the wrong village could earn you a hefty dose of cabbage-based justice, especially at festivals or fairs where rival towns gathered. There are records of entire families being pelted with beetroot, onions and turnips simply for winning too many prizes in the sack race or having the audacity to own a prize cow. Serious crimes called for serious consequences. Offenders like thieves faced losing an ear, while poachers could be branded and those who repeated the crime were banished. But for most small, everyday infractions, the aim went beyond mere penalty. It focused on public correction. The thinking was that a dose of shame now would save the community hassle later on. Whether that strategy actually worked is up for debate, but it certainly gave everyone a chance to participate. For some, the punishment became a social spectacle, a chance to air their grudges, settle old scores, and test their arm with a well-aimed throw. For others, it served as a clear warning. Behave, or that cabbage might be launched at you next. There's something inherently human about a community that gathers not just to judge, but to take part in the theatre of penance. After all, why waste a perfectly good cabbage in the soup when it could be hurled at your neighbour's ego? So, the next time you make a slip-up, take comfort. At least, your worst consequence is a passive-aggressive email or a grumpy online review. In Tudor England, the only thing thicker than the justice was the stew, and both were best served with humble pie and maybe a flying head of cabbage. Special rules applied for holidays and festivals. Sometimes not partying was actually illegal. Other times you could be fined for singing too loudly once the sun went down. The calendar itself felt like one long test of your ability to keep up with the shifting regulations. Welcome to the Tudor year, where every month brought a new decree and a fresh chance to break the law accidentally. On Midsummer's Eve, for example, local law required you to join your neighbours and parade around a bonfire, because nothing screams public safety like setting fire to a giant woodpile while half the village is tipsy. Fail to show up? That earns you a fine and the reputation of being a witch, a Puritan, or most unforgivable of all, no fun. But don't get too lost in your revels. After a specific hour, the merrymaking had to be drastically scaled back. Singing, dancing, or excessive maypole enthusiasm after curfew would land you in hot water with the parish constable, who took his job as the inspector of noise very seriously. There were genuine laws detailing when you could bang a drum, who was allowed to ring a bell, and how many verses of Green Sleeves were too many. The answer, according to one fed-up mayor, was 2. Christmas was another regulatory minefield. For 12 days, feasting, games, and even a little gentle gambling were encouraged, but only in precise amounts. Eat too little, and you were suspected of secretly observing Lent. Eat too much, and you were hauled before the local magistrate for gluttony, or worse, for immodest pudding consumption. The Lord of Misrule, chosen to oversee the Christmas celebration, was technically in charge, but the local vicar was always lurking nearby, ready to call time on the fun if things became too rowdy. Translation: if anyone started singing bawdy songs before the 3rd cup of ale. Harvest festivals were another legal high wire. Villagers were obligated to bring in the crops, celebrate the bounty, and give thanks, but absolutely no unruly conduct, please. There was always a new proclamation about which games were permitted, how many apple carts could be raced down the hill, and whether last year's incident with the runaway sheep would be repeated. It usually was. Even birthdays, weddings, and saints' days were watched with a hawk's eye. Want to throw a party for your youngest? Make sure you haven't scheduled it on a minor saint's feast or during the week of a major fast. One slip-up and you'd have the church warden at your door asking pointed questions about your cake recipe and whether you prayed before the dancing started. And for every must-celebrate occasion, there was a corresponding must-abstain rule. Some days it was illegal to work, to eat meat, or to sing secular songs. On others, it was mandatory to hang greenery over your doorway or risk a visit from the town busybody. The Tudors were masters at keeping detailed records of who did what, when, and with whom, which, come to think of it, is a tradition still very much alive in small towns everywhere. For the truly unlucky, seasonal rules could overlap. Imagine being caught skipping church on Easter because you stayed up too late at the midsummer fire, only to be fined for missing both the holy day and the curfew. Your only defence would be to plead confusion, which was the Tudor version of my calendar app didn't update. Through it all, the people of Tudor England kept going, singing, feasting, occasionally bickering, but always showing up when the law demanded it. Because in this world, the only thing worse than too much fun was not enough. So, next time your neighbour invites you to a party, remember that in the Tudor calendar, celebration is a civic duty, and your attendance might just keep you out of trouble, or land you right in it, depending on the hour. Cheers to midsummer mayhem and the never-ending dance of regulations. It was less about what you actually did, and more about what people said you did. Tudor justice often relied on rumour, reputation, and how convincingly you could deny everything without cracking. If the village gossip took a dislike to you, expect problems. Picture yourself in a tiny Tudor village where everyone knows everyone and, more importantly, everyone else's business. There are no secrets here, only stories waiting to sprout legs and sprint across the parish. The village gossip wasn't just a person, but a public institution armed with an invisible badge and a mouth that never rested. Her favourite weapon? The loaded question, "Did you hear about Thomas and the vicar's goose?" Suddenly you're on trial for poultry theft, and you haven't even left the house yet. The legal system, for all its statutes and fines, worked hand in hand with the informal court of public opinion. The local constable might keep records, but the real files were stored in the minds of the old women by the well and the men gathered at the smithy. A single rumour could send someone to the pillory or, at the very least, have the churchwarden knocking with concerns. Don't assume you can hide behind logic or evidence. In Tudor England, the truth was flexible, like the eels in the river or the mare's hairline. It was all about who told the best story and who believed it first. If you were accused of watering down ale, the rumour alone was enough to thin out your business faster than the strongest hops. If your neighbour insisted you were seen sneaking around the hen house at midnight, expect suspicious glares for a month and the occasional surprise egg in your shoe. Women were especially vulnerable to this kind of scrutiny. The scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the mouth, was reserved for those accused of gossiping too much or, ironically, complaining about gossip. Of course, the men who started rumours rarely faced such inventive punishment. Instead, they merely got the satisfaction of knowing they'd successfully ruined someone's week with nothing but a whisper and a nudge. Sometimes the village gossip was helpful. A warning about bad cheese, a heads up that the ale taster was on his way, or a reminder that the turnip inspector is allergic to turnips. But more often, it was the source of your latest headache. Accusations of witchcraft started with a bad harvest and an offhand comment about your suspiciously healthy cabbages. Disputes over property lines or borrowed tools quickly escalated when fuelled by a steady stream of back-fence commentary. The church, naturally, had a stake in all this. Public penance was as much about appeasing the local grapevine as it was about justice. If you confessed your sins on Sunday, it wasn't just for forgiveness. It was to ensure everyone heard your version of the story before Mrs. Parsons spun it into a 3-part saga featuring goats, an illicit pie, and the mayor's missing socks. Surviving this environment took skill. The best defence was to cultivate your own network of counter-gossips, friends, relatives, and at least one helpful child who could relay what was being whispered at the well. A few well-timed acts of charity, helping the elderly with firewood, sharing your best onions, or simply not being too successful, could help shield you from the worst of the rumour mill. Yet for all its flaws, gossipy justice was a system everyone understood. It was unpredictable, exhausting, and almost impossible to avoid, but it did keep people in line. After all, your reputation was your most valuable asset. Lose it, and you might as well move to the next village and start over, and even then the gossip would probably arrive before you did. So, the next time you worry about office politics or neighbourhood chatter, be grateful. At least you don't have to fear the scold's bridle or an entire town convinced you're secretly churning butter with the devil's help. In Tudor England, justice wasn't just blind. It was nosy, relentless, and truly excellent at remembering your worst mistakes. Not even death got you off the hook. If your will wasn't in order, or you died owing a fine, your corpse could be denied burial, or worse, your family fined double. Congratulations. The paperwork follows you into the afterlife. Let's say you've survived decades of Tudor life, braved Lent, dodged the pie inspectors, paid your beard tax, and stayed on the right side of the turnip inspector. At last, you shuffle off this mortal coil, ready for a well-earned rest. Not so fast. The legal hurdles are only just starting. In Tudor England, dying was a bureaucratic event. If you hadn't already written a will, expect the church, the crown, and at least 3 relatives you haven't seen since the last plague outbreak to descend on your house like crows at a harvest. Wills were not a luxury, they were a civic duty. The law expected every householder, man or woman, rich or poor, to have a will tucked away, preferably somewhere that wouldn't be mistaken for kindling. Failing to leave instructions for your possessions could mean chaos for your family. Who gets your good shoes? What about the pewter tankard, the sheep, the leftover candle stubs? The court would decide for you, and rest assured their ideas about fair distribution often ended with the local bailiff acquiring your best onions. But even the best-laid wills weren't safe from trouble. The church expected a mortuary fee, a special payment for the privilege of being buried in consecrated ground. Can't pay? Then your body might linger unburied on the edge of the churchyard until someone coughed up the required amount. In some towns, a sign was actually hung on your door. Funeral delayed, insufficient funds. Neighbours would walk by, shake their heads, and mutter about the perils of poor planning. If you happened to die in debt, things got even more complicated. Your unpaid fines and bills passed directly to your loved ones. Children, siblings, even distant cousins could receive a cheerful visit from the local reeve demanding payment. Tudor collectors were tireless, convinced that nothing promoted family togetherness like the shared burden of an ancestor's debt. Fines could be doubled for the inconvenience, and if your family was unable to pay, your remaining possessions might be seized and sold at public auction, often to the very neighbour who accused you of cheating at dice last Michaelmas. Then there was the posthumous shaming. If you'd managed to upset the church, failed to pay tithes, or left behind any unresolved disputes, your family could be ordered to do public penance on your behalf. This could mean standing in church in a special mourning smock, confessing your loved one's failings and promising never to let such a thing happen again. Nothing says rest in peace like your children apologising for your outstanding cheese tax while the whole village watches. And don't forget the paperwork. Probate courts processed thousands of wills, each with its own peculiarities and opportunities for mischief. Disputes erupted over the tiniest bequests. To my second cousin Anne, I leave my second best spoon, with rival claimants emerging from the woodwork like moths to a flame. If your will was unclear, your family could be locked in legal combat for months, all while the parish clerk charged for every stamped copy, every lost sheep, and every official sigh of exasperation. Some Tudors tried to get clever hiding assets, leaving coded messages or naming their pet goose as executor, but the law was usually one step ahead and stories abound of clever bequests unravelling before the ink was dry. In the end, the only certainty was that death offered no escape from the Tudor obsession with order and documentation. So next time you groan about modern bureaucracy, remember, in Tudor England you could be fined after your funeral, shamed by your children, and upstaged by your own will. The paperwork quite literally never ends. Think your snapback is controversial? In Tudor England, the wrong hat could get you fined, shamed, or accused of impersonating the gentry. There were laws dictating who could wear what on their head, right down to the feathers. Show up at church in a hat too fancy for your station, and suddenly you're the lead suspect in a scandal involving social mobility and one very angry parish priest. Let's step into the bustling world of Tudor millinery, a universe where hats are more than just accessories. They're legal evidence, status symbols, and occasionally the main event at the local scandal. Every morning, putting on your hat was a strategic act. Are you a labourer, allowed only the simplest felt cap? Or a merchant, permitted a bit of colour but nothing resembling silk? If you're a noble, the world is your haberdashery oyster, with velvets, feathers, and jewels piled high. Everyone else had to play by the rules or risk a legal fashion faux pas. The sumptuary laws were everywhere, and hats were one of their most visible and viciously enforced features. These statutes existed to keep everyone in their social lane. Only those with the right income or lineage could don certain materials, trims or colours. A farmer with a feathered cap? Outrageous. A tailor's apprentice seen in a velvet bonnet? Expect a visit from the sumptuary inspector, a man whose main qualification was the ability to sniff out forbidden millinery from 50 paces. Feathers, in particular, were a minefield. Swan's feathers for the lords, cock's feathers for gentlemen, and if you were truly unfortunate, goose feathers for everyone else. And don't even dream of ostrich plumes unless you wanted to be accused of planning a coup. The wrong feather on your hat was a fast track to the church porch for a public telling off and possibly a fine that stung more than the plume itself. It became even more complicated at special events. Church services, holidays, and court appearances all had their own hat codes. Show up, underdressed, and you'd be mistaken for a pauper. Overdo it, and suddenly you're aspiring above your station, which was the Tudor equivalent of wearing sunglasses indoors, bold, offensive, and guaranteed to provoke outrage. The parish priest, who was supposed to care about your soul, now cared deeply about your headwear. He might even work your hat into the Sunday sermon. Woe to those who wear velvet bonnets without a proper blessing. For women, hats and hoods were an entire legal category. The length of your veil, the colour of your coif, the shape of your headdress, each detail was a coded signal to the world. Unmarried, modest cap. Married, you may indulge in a touch of lace. A widow, back to basics. If you were caught borrowing your neighbour's French hood for a quick trip to the market, expect her to notice and the gossip to follow you home before you'd even finished shopping. Enforcement was creative and, as always, public. Get caught in an illegal hat and you might be forced to parade through town wearing your offending headgear pinned with a note reading "Pretender." Or, for the especially bold, a full set of kitchen utensils to signal you've confused your status with your stew pot. Repeat offenders could face larger fines or, worse, be banned from market day until they could prove they owned a perfectly legal cap. The regulations were intended to maintain social order and prevent commoners from climbing the ranks, yet they merely inspired a clandestine world of smuggled headwear, secret hat makers, and quiet late-night exchanges among the ambitious folk of the town. Where there's a desire and a bonnet with an extra flourish, there's always a solution. So the next time you stress about dressing appropriately, spare a thought for the Tudors. It was an era where the style of your hat could land you in more trouble than an actual tax cheat or a delinquent radish. Wear it nicely, but choose with caution, because in Tudor England your head was only as secure as the legality of your headwear. Thinking of growing a few root vegetables behind your little house? You'd better check in with the local law enforcement. During Tudor times, even your modest vegetable plot was subject to the watchful eye of the crown. Certain kinds of produce were banned, others were kept only for the wealthy, and one unauthorised squash could result in your garden being inspected, which is simply a nice way of saying it got flattened by goats belonging to someone important. It's the break of dawn, and you're outside gripping a shovel, yearning for an easy life. But before you even consider setting a single carrot, you're nervously looking around for the sheriff, the overseer, or the occasional roaming vegetable assessor. Yes, that was a real position. The Tudors had rules for everything, and agriculture was no exception. Not even the sanctuary of your back garden was safe from official decree. Cultivate the wrong thing, and you might as well be growing rebellion. So let's start with the list of forbidden plants. Some flora, like saffron, were so valuable that only the affluent or those with royal connections were allowed to raise them. Saffron plots were documented, closely monitored, and occasionally raided in the name of the monarch. Woad, the famous blue dye source, was restricted because the authorities did not want common people strolling around resembling minor nobility, or worse, like the Welsh. During holiday seasons, certain fruit trees were reserved exclusively for the great estates. If your apple tree yielded fruit that was too sweet, you could expect a visit from a fruit overseer with suspiciously deep pockets. Even everyday produce came with caveats. Asparagus was seen as a luxury item, lettuce, a symbol of standing. And peas, well, peas were fine as long as you didn't grow an excessive amount and accidentally kick off your own agricultural revolution. The finest onions and leeks were snapped up by the upper class, leaving the rest of us with sadly undersized bulbs and a faint hope of a decent deal on market day. The biggest threat to your garden, however, wasn't the weather or insects. It was official review. Formal garden checks happened whenever the local lord was bored or there was a rumour that the Queen might be visiting the area. The inspectors, typically a mix of lower officials, overly curious neighbours and that one roving goat, would sweep through, counting plants, searching for illegal greens, and quietly helping themselves to anything especially impressive. Protesting was futile. The legal system, after all, supported their actions, and the goats were beyond negotiation. Tudor gardening was also an exercise in mutual suspicion. Neighbours kept a keen watch on each other's patches, partly out of envy and partly because there were penalties for failing to report an illegally large squash. Imagine the shock when a pumpkin you grew for the town's harvest celebration gets you called before the estate owner accused of excessive squashing. You're forced to explain your ambitious gardening while the bailiff measures your turnips for proof of aspiring to a higher status. Using compost, rotating crops, and other advanced gardening methods could spark alarm. Too much success was viewed as a sign you had too much free time and money, a risky combination in a society preoccupied with everyone knowing their station. If your yield was better than your neighbours', expect hushed talk about magical seeds or, even worse, accusations of witchcraft. Witches, the rumour went, always had the most thriving gardens. Just ask anyone whose parsley patch looked a little too lush. If you hoped to expand, you needed official authorization, more paperwork than a small noble's property, and, naturally, a little favour for the local officer. A full basket of carrots worked wonders, as did a pledge not to outdo his radishes next growing season. Crop theft was common, but to bring a case to court meant navigating a complicated maze of land laws, property rights, and sworn statements from 3 neighbours and a somewhat bewildered cow. So, next time you're planting tomatoes or admiring your plump zucchini, remember the Tudors. A world where the Queen herself could theoretically lay claim to your onions, and where the only thing more regulated than your garden was your headwear. Keep your planting neat, your records close, and your pumpkins hidden, because in Tudor England, even your vegetables had to respect the social hierarchy. Children were not simply small-scale adults. They were subject to their own set of laws, from the age you were legally permitted to work to the types of games you could play and which songs were forbidden on May Day. The Tudor state had strong opinions about the lives of the young. Try playing leapfrog on a Sunday, and you might receive a visit from the local morality officer and a lengthy sermon you couldn't sleep through. Life as a Tudor youngster was far from simple. Forget about roaming freely and without care. The moment you were able to walk, you were able to work. And everyone, from your parents to the village constable, had a firm opinion on how you should spend your time. There were rules about who could tend the geese, who was allowed to assist in the fields, and, most importantly, how much mischief you could manage before someone brought out the discipline rod. By the time you turned 7, you were officially deemed capable of light labour, which usually meant the chores no adult wanted, such as chasing crows, shooing cats off the roof of the baker's, and collecting manure with a bright pail and a sombre expression. School, for those fortunate enough to attend, was yet another world of stricture. Lessons ran from the moment the sun rose until it set, punctuated only by chores, church, and the occasional outbreak of disease. Teachers took their duty as moulders of young minds very seriously, and so did their birch canes. Pity the student who misspelled goose with a Z or drew pictures in their textbook's margins. Both offences would likely earn you extra work and a sore backside. The curriculum focused heavily on religious verses and moral fables, with a solid mix of Latin, math, and advice on how to avoid becoming a vagrant. Recreation, when it came, was both a small miracle and a legal tightrope walk. Certain activities were okay: hopscotch tag, and any game that involved running in circles until you were exhausted. Others, however, were strictly prohibited by local custom or actual statute. Leapfrog, for reasons that remain unclear, was considered dangerously wild. On Sundays, ball games risked smashing the church's glass, and singing particular songs was thought to foster laziness, or, worse, uncontrolled dancing. If you needed to burn off energy, you were expected to stick to the officially sanctioned games, and even then be ready for a reprimand if your laughter became too boisterous. Then came the holidays, when children were finally permitted to relax, but not excessively. May Day, with its ribbons, blossoms, and traditional music, was monitored by a small army of adults, ensuring no one recited the wrong lyrics or lost their footwear in the festive crowd around the maypole. During Christmastide, children would act in Mama's plays, but only after their lines were carefully checked for accidental blasphemy and any unsanctioned jokes about the local authority. Jobs for young people had their own detailed ranking. The oldest boy might be sent to learn a trade with a metalsmith. Younger kids found work where they could, fetching water, selling goods at the market, or serving as professional bird shoers. Girls were put to work spinning, sewing, or helping in the kitchen, and, if they were truly unlucky, given the task of cleaning out the toilet pail before lessons. All these tasks came with rules, from appropriate attire to approved speech. Curse too loudly while peeling potatoes, and the town gossip might report you to the vicar. Most of all, children were expected to show deference to adults, the church, and most importantly, the endless flow of regulations. Even playtime was controlled, with parish officers peering over fences to catch any excessively rowdy behaviour. The dream of sneaking off to fish or picking forbidden wild fruit was always balanced by the fear of being caught and sentenced to a week of peeling root vegetables as punishment. Yet, despite all the rules, Tudor children found ways to play, laugh, and bend a few regulations when no one was watching. Childhood, as it always is, was about testing limits, ideally without getting caught. So, the next time you see a kid scaling a barrier or singing with full voice, remember the Tudors, a time when every leap, giggle and soothing song required official permission and sometimes a really good story. Dreaming of a bright, well-lit home? That'll cost you. Tudor England introduced taxes on windows, which resulted in some truly imaginative and unpleasantly chilly architectural choices. Entire communities ended up living in near darkness, just to avoid paying an extra coin. And if you tried to bypass the system with a makeshift ventilation opening, you risked both a penalty and a life of vitamin D deficiency. Picture moving into your ideal cottage, wattle and daub walls, a straw roof, and in your mind's eye, beautiful sunshine pouring through large, clear windows. Then reality hits. The local tax assessor is lurking with his counting device in hand, scrutinising your house and logging every single opening. That tiny opening near the chimney? That's a window. The drafty gap in your bedroom wall? A window. The decorative hole you claim is just for letting the house breathe? Definitely a window. and likely double taxed if the bailiff is in a bad mood. The law was straightforward. More windows meant higher taxes. Officially, this was a way to fund public works and royal endeavours. Unofficially, it was an attack on personal comfort and natural light. The result? The Tudor countryside was littered with dismal cottages, awkward brick patches where windows once were, and residents squinting like blind animals at high noon. Towns developed a distinctive look, small narrow openings set high up, as if the houses were built for giants or people with an intense fear of the sun. Builders, never ones to give up easily, got creative. They invented false windows, fake openings bricked in or painted to appear real from a distance, fooling only the most inattentive tax collector. Ventilation slots cleverly disguised as decorative elements became popular, although they rarely worked as intended. For every tax successfully avoided, there was an equivalent and unwelcome gust of wind whistling through the house like a vengeful spirit. Insulation was still centuries away, so you either paid for light or paid for extra blankets, which naturally were also taxed. But that's a separate grievance. The consequences of this cleverness were as obvious as they were grim. The less light you allowed in, the colder and more depressing your home became. In the dead of winter, the typical Tudor house felt somewhere between a root cellar and a trendy tomb. Vitamin D shortages were not just common. They were the source of folk remedies, with people being told to stand outside at noon, face the sun, and try not to look too cheerful. That, too, raised suspicions. Meanwhile, families conducted all their business by candlelight, which meant more smoke, a greater risk of fire, and of course more chances for the tax collector to observe that your ventilation hole now looked suspiciously like a window from the exterior. Naturally, trying to bypass the system was always hazardous. The tax review officers were not just persistent, they were known to be spiteful. If you were caught, the penalties could bankrupt a family. Local folklore told of a baker's wife who walled up her windows every spring and tore them down again in the fall, a seasonal routine that ended when the inspector fell into her geese pond and taxed her for the view. And then there were the unexpected outcomes. Marriages ended over arguments about light. "You promised we could have two." Children developed excellent night vision, and local artists despaired of ever completing a good portrait without the subject's face being mostly lost in shadow. If you dared to install real glass, you'd better be prepared to defend your choice to every neighbour, visitor and random passerby wearing a tax collector's badge. Yet, like everything Tudor, the window tax was met with dissatisfaction, ingenuity and a bit of shared comedy. Neighbours exchanged tips on how to draw a convincing draft, the best spots to steal a nap in a sunbeam if you could find one, and how to use a single window to illuminate an entire room by having everyone stand in a row. So the next time you open your blinds and let the light stream into your home, remember the Tudors, a population so determined to avoid taxes they invented the world's darkest home interiors and the draftiest puns. If only they had taxed dampness instead, every home would have been a palace of glass. So, as you settle in tonight, just take a moment to appreciate the truly heroic journey you've completed. You made it through a day under the relentless scrutiny of Tudor law, where even your socks could get you called to court, your beard might be taxed, and someone's actual job was to examine your dinner for unauthorized meat content. You navigated the dinner table rules with the skill of a seasoned secret agent, avoided the wrath of the turnip inspector, and successfully refrained from insulting anyone's hat, at least not where they could hear you. You sidestepped curfews, fees on candles, gossip, and the world's most judgmental clothing police. And somehow you managed all of that without a single flushing toilet, a video guide, or the ability to just search for the answer online. That, my friend, is true persistence. The Tudors had to carefully step through a chaotic field of rules, social conventions and penalties, big and small, peculiar and utterly bizarre, all while still finding the time to live, laugh, love, and occasionally survive religious fasting. Their lives were messy, loud, smelly, and dangerous. Yet they formed communities, raised families, and clung tightly to any bit of happiness they could find. Sometimes that joy was even found in a well-aimed cabbage. So tonight, as you get comfortable in your clean bed, wearing your modern pyjamas, with running water and the sheer luxury of reading after dark, perhaps offer a quiet thanks to the people who came before us. The ones who put up with fleas, bloodletting, window taxes, and the constant threat of a pie inspection, all so that centuries later you could enjoy the simple comfort of matching socks and snacks that are mostly legal. Because history may be disgusting and often terrifying, but it's also solid proof that people are stubborn, full of hope, and, let's be honest, kind of absurd. Sleep soundly, and remember, whatever tomorrow brings, at least it won't be a public confrontation about a cabbage. Good night.